Today we've got Ronel Stevens with us, who is a program director at Mosaic Training Service and Healing Center. It's an African feminist community-based NGO founded in 1993, providing quality, holistic and integrated GBV prevention and response. Amazing. Welcome today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
So, Ronel, tell us a bit more about Mosaic and how it started.
Mosaic's story started in 1993, which is very similar to the story of South Africa's democracy. And at the time, there hadn't been laws that really protected domestic violence or survivors of domestic violence very specifically. And so one of our biggest kind of like leaps was really ensuring that we think through what survivor-centered and trauma-informed services looks like when there's nothing. And so the story is really, someone asked me in the week, what does mosaic mean? It's not short for anything, but really it's the idea of broken pieces creating a beautiful view. And with that, it's thinking about a country that has come from so much brokenness during apartheid, thinking about ways we are able to create this beautiful image and how we are able to do that together and what it is that we have. And so that pretty much is an analogy for Mosaic's story as well. And so it really was training women from the community to be able to do trauma-informed work, and then having those women be the representation for what the government or what NGOs couldn't do at the time, and really building that kind of trust in the system. And so Mosaic is really that. It's like building a beautiful story together.
Amazing. I love that. Okay, so your main focus areas at Mosaic are obviously GBV, and are you expanding into other areas at all?
Yeah, I think GBV itself, the sector is quite broad. And so you'll find certain organizations working specifically with rape. You'll find organizations working in technology. You'll find organizations working in advocacy. And so our work really is based around response, which is the immediate need, the crisis, the emergency. And we focus around domestic violence, which is both sexual violence and different forms of abuse that happens within like a domestic setting. Whilst we focus on response, we also realize that there's a huge gap in terms of prevention. And so we wanted to make sure that we really engage on what do you do when someone discloses to you that there's violence happening in their home, and what are the next steps? And so it really is about making the law and the policies very palatable for people in the community. So it's not just about lawyers and those stakeholders who do the work to understand, but it's also about, the spiritual healers, the community leaders, the person next door, understanding what that law is and how it can be impacted and where they can go to activate the laws. And so while we do the prevention and the response, of course, it's also important to be able to ensure that there's a loop of communication between what happens on the ground and what is promised in the policy. And so our advocacy is really looking towards the things that happens in the national pillar meetings, but also ensuring that there's a clear conversation between the community members that are experiencing the law and what those experiences kind of teach us, and how we're able to take that teaching back to government and the policymakers to start thinking through. So it really is about localizing the policies.
Okay, perfect. And in your opinion, why is GBV so prolific in South Africa? I mean, we've got really high stats compared to the rest of the world. It seems to be just getting worse as well.
It's a combination. I think for us working in the sector, we have to find hope, right? And so when we look at these numbers and we see the growing numbers, it's for us to think through, is the number growing because people are help seeking and they're actually reporting what's happening? Or is it a matter of a situation that's completely out of control? And it's a bit of both. And I would say that there's clear awareness from a government level of just the seriousness. I think what we are looking for is a bit of urgency around what happens now that we know. I would also say, I mean, the stats are really startling. The femicide rates are 5 times higher than the global average. And so we can't ignore that, right? We can't say that, oh, it's only something that's happening inside people's homes. It's private. It's none of our business. It's becoming more and more closer to all of us, even those working in policy. And so my response to your question would probably look like what's different for us is knowing that people are able to access a service. We want to know that the service is available. We want to know that the service is quality because much like you don't want to go to a half doctor, right? You want to go to a qualified individual that's able to counsel you and also direct you and refer you to all of the right services, and to trust that those services are actually there and is also going to be extending quality services. So it's about building that trust within the system. and also ensuring that we don't kind of ignore the fact that this is not like GBV is the event, if you will. And there is like a deeper lining root to this work. It's about the experiences that we had during colonization, apartheid, thinking about, emasculation that happened during that time, how there wasn't a focus really about what happens inside the home. It's about thinking about harmful norms that had been generated for years and years under the helm of culture. And so it's having to rethink about what are these underlying reasons for this violence and the emergence of this violence to happen, and really for us to start in our kind of prevention work collectively, not just alone as Mosaic, but as a collective, really start thinking about how do we work through that. So we try and do it through workshops, we try and do it through conversations, we try and open up space that even persons who use violence are able to access the service, because it's about not being in judgment, but really trying to think about how are we able to collectively work at the root of the problem and not just solving, like, what the event is showing.
Surface. Yes. Okay, so there seems to be such a disconnect between the South African government and communities. I think communities are getting more and more frustrated that, I mean, on social media, you can see some of the posts of like community leaders saying, look at what's happened here tonight, or in this event, there's been shootings, this woman's been raped, or children affected by that. What are your thoughts on all of this?
I think it's powerful. We come from a country where there's always been a lot of resilience and communities showing up, for one
Yeah.
another, and also holding government accountable. So this is not new, kind of in the landscape of South Africa. What I will say is new and different is that I don't know if there's enough of an uproar around gender-based violence and actually trying to understand why it's happening and how, you use the word prolific, and I think that is quite a powerful word. We have in recent times heard it being described as a national disaster, but what does that really look like? And what is needed to solve the problem, if we will, or how do we get to a place where we actually are managing what's happening in communities? And what I also hear is, I guess, a bigger frustration, like the work that we do is in communities where there are high levels of other social crimes. And so it's kind of building one on the other. And I think that if there isn't clear visibility of accountability or of kind of law and policy showing up, it is easy for someone to make a comment about things not working. But I will say that in some of the communities that we are working, we see people trying. We see organizations and local police officers and court managers and clerks and social workers coming together, teachers, parents, wanting to ensure that the service is being delivered and at the level that it should be, and also figuring out ways that they are able to work as a collective to make sure and ensure that that happens. And I think that's kind of like where the focus and the energy should be. How can government come closer in a way that's meaningful to actually understand what happens in the local context and to ensure that there is an injection of resources? And we're not just talking about finances, we're thinking about what is out of the box kind of services look like. If there's only one police vehicle, they're not able to get to all the required spaces. But if we start thinking about, okay, why don't we get maybe two more vehicles? Or we start thinking about like police stations that's closer to one another. How do we kind of refer services, especially in spaces where kind of urban and peri-urban and rural spaces, like, the geographic spaces in between really is huge, and it really leaves room for a lot of things to happen within those spaces. And so I think from our perspective, the government is trying. We call ourselves critical friends of government because while they support us in some very crucial ways, I mean, our shelters are extended by the Department of Social Development and also through the Department of Public Works. We do work in courts, Department of Justice. We do work in community spaces. So it's happening. But I think I'm seeing a gap really, or what we see as organization as a gap, is the coordination between the services. So if there's an understanding between the Department of Social Development very clearly with the Department of Justice, the National Prosecuting Authority, like, if all of us were to work together in a very kind of harmonious way, I think that what you will see is that a client will be held rather than being sent from pillar to post. Yeah. So
Exactly.
that may be one of the ways. Instead of saying that it's not working, is maybe trying looking at what could work and trying to implement some of those. Yeah.
Perfect. So I wanted to jump onto the biggest misconceptions when it comes to gender-based violence, and also how does Mosaic then support the woman trying to escape these situations?
I mean, the biggest misconceptions is even this. It's not trying to like deep dive and understand what the statistics are really trying to tell us. I know when I grew up, I don't know if this is similar for you, but generationally speaking, like when I grew up, I was afraid of the big scary monster man outside of my home. But the violence, especially what we are working with, is inside the home,
Yeah.
and so I think that there's a bit of a reckoning that needs to happen. There's a bit of a realization that we all need to make that South Africans are traumatized. We are traumatized, and trauma begets trauma. And so it's having to think about how do we start having an intergenerational conversation about what is happening. For example, how do we think about parenting? How do we think about discipline in the home? Because all of those things actually exacerbate harmful gender norms and really like exacerbates the kind of violence that we see. How do we break cycles of violence? How do we create some awareness? How do we create spaces that's not about gossip, but really about like finding ways to connect survivors who need the help to the services, but also not turning a blind eye to the persons who use violence in relationships, is recognizing the fact that there's also trauma there, and how do we as organizations get together to hold accountable but also support. Because the reality is that, in our work, we've had to realize that love is love. And whilst we can all talk about or have judgment about that you should leave and why you should leave and what you should do as a next step, sometimes it's about being able to like fix the relationship and to pause the violence or to like stop the violence and to think about ways in which we are able to do that. I think that the law, I think some of the misconceptions may also be that survivors are women. The reality is that our work shows us that it's persons living with disabilities, it is elderly people, it is men, it is members of the LGBTQI community. So what we saw in 1993 really is showing us a different face in 2026. And it's recognizing that we now need to like reorganize our thinking around that. I also think that there's a lot of misconception about like who can be a survivor. So if you're at university, can you be a survivor? Are you in a relationship, or are you meant to go to university? What's the age? There's something around like young people can't be survivors, but the reality is that more than 20 million children are exposed to violence inside the homes. And it's like recognizing that we are, by not doing anything, perpetuating the violence and actually normalizing harm. And so I think that in terms of misconception, also, I think thinking through who is able to help. Someone from Europe had a conversation with me, and they were like, it's so strange that South Africans are actually reaching out to a system, but also claiming that the system doesn't work. And I was like, I wonder what that is about, because we do want to trust that the system will work and that it maybe was a once off story and not really going to be my story. And that's really the persons that we are wanting to like ensure we keep that support going for them. I would also say that like a misconception for me, or that has come quite prominent in our work, is that you're not able to solve the problem, and that people can solve a problem with one solution. The reality is that our work is really based on what we call a continuum of care. So if you come to a court where we are based, you're not just seeing the court support worker who helps you with the application for a protection order, but you're also connected to a social worker. You're also connected to a support group. You're also connected to training to learn what your human rights are and where you can go to activate them. You also then become part of a bigger ambassador program. And so I think for us, and particularly how we see our work, it's not about Mosaic being able to like carry the baton and the mantle for everyone. The reality is that I'm sitting here representing so many other organizations who are doing the work and that are tirelessly working towards a community or a society free from harm and violence. But it does take us all, and it does take a reconsideration of what had worked and how we may need to think about what needs to work better, or how we need to reorganize ourselves towards that. And so this is also a bit of an encouragement to start thinking that it's not just organizations based in the GBV sector, but also to start thinking about how can others get involved. People who understand comms, people who understand data, individuals and corporations, because there seems to also be a strong separation between who gets to be part of this process and also who is impacted by this. I think that that's also an opportunity for us to like reorganize the norms around that. And also, we welcome researchers, but we want them to work alongside us. So I definitely think there's opportunity for more industry to get involved.
Perfect. That makes so much sense. So, okay, with these extremely high numbers, it seems a bit obvious, but what are some unexpected or hidden red flags?
Hidden red flags, we often talk about the hidden costs. You know, in the work that we do, we recognize that
Yeah.
it's not just the barriers to justice, it's not just the inaccessible services, but it's also thinking about how this has an economic cost for the country. You know, the GDP and how that is linked to the violence. If there is violence in the home, there's no concentration in class. You know, if there's violence in the home, there's no productivity that happens within that space. You can't think about the next step. You are consistently kind of consumed by what is happening. We are also recognizing that there's like deep ties to kind of economic dependency. So you're not able to make financially viable decisions. And I think what often happens in these cases, like I mentioned before, if you're not able to recognize that someone is going through violence because they're wearing a suit and a tie, or that they're extending violence because they don't look like a violent person, I think it really does allow us an opportunity to kind of reimagine what this boogeyman looks like, you know? We had a campaign that we were trying to think about where it's like the faceless perpetrator, because everyone always wants to like portray it as like an individual who is black, who is socioeconomic, who's low in the socioeconomic scale, who lives in a informal settlement. That's who extends violence and that's who experiences violence. But we know that that's not the truth, you know, especially if you look on the number. But it also means that those survivors who needs the help are not able to access the help because they don't, you know, perform the victimhood, I guess, in a sense, for lack of a better phrasing. But I want to say that, you know, when we're thinking about the misconception and like the hidden red flags, for us, it's always about being able to, when someone discloses, and this is at every level, is to know that the first thing that you want to do is to ensure that you affirm the speaker, the survivor, and you let them know that there is help. And you also have to communicate that while this is private, you have to reach out, or confidential, you have to reach out to someone else to activate the support. So you have to communicate that while we are having this conversation, and I hold what you share with me very closely, in order for us to be able to extend support, I know someone who's a social worker, or I know of an organization. Maybe we can look at it together. Maybe we can go to the court together. And I think it's part of like a process of thinking through walking along the journey and not also having to like feel completely accountable to the individual. I think being able to refer to the help, being able to like make aware of the help, being able to even reflect back, saying, you know, if it's someone that is financially reliant on their partner, being able to communicate that you are noticing something and that you wanted to just share that with them. And it doesn't need to be confrontational, and it also doesn't need to look like an engagement of judgment, but rather to create an opportunity at least where you're able to like share and also able to direct your friend or colleague or family member to where the help actually exists. And so I think that, you know, it always sounds like it needs to be bigger than it really is. We often hear people talk about going to like a pastor or priest or a spiritual healer. Absolutely. You know, once the healing happens, it's also about that individual to take the responsibility of asking, are you safe to go home? And then being able to refer to next help support. I think that the country has also done a lot of work in terms of making a GBV command center available 24 hours. We often use it as well because a lot of the communities we work in, the social worker that's on duty for 24 hours is not able to access all of the spaces where the help is needed. And so it's having to rely on other sources that's available as well. And so wanting to also like recognize that there are systems that we are able to access and that we are able to activate, and for ourselves to become more knowledgeable about what those are and being able to communicate that and share that, and not just do it when there's a crisis, but also just like, you know, in regular conversation, I love what Sana Lifestyle is doing. You know, you're a wellness hub, but you're creating a conversation about something that otherwise will be privatized, you know. And so I do think that there's opportunity for us to create more spaces like this where you're able to share, create awareness, and also able to create like next steps for individuals who may be confronted with a disclosure.
Exactly. I think one of the biggest things we've seen is that, as you were saying with misconceptions, is that there's this idea that these problems only exist in certain scenarios, and it couldn't be further from the truth. And culturally, also, a lot of us are taught to kind of hide these things or keep quiet about it or pretend they're not there. It's just, it's not right. You've touched on the complication of economic dependence and all of that. So I want to, I mean, that's a huge, I think that affects most women possibly in this situation. But I wanted to jump onto the effects because obviously, you know, you think of gender based violence, you can think of all the physical effects of that rape, violence, beating, all of that. But how does it affect the mental health? Because that's another whole other component.
You know, the thing that I also maybe want to use as a bit of a proviso is the fact that organizations, NGOs have to become so agile. You know, mental health kind of was in its own silo in the same way that like GBV was in its own silo. We have to like figure out how to like work together and also what that looked like generationally because trauma is passed down from one generation to another. And so we have that kind of awareness already about mental health and how that weighs on children who had been exposed to violence in the home or had experienced violence themselves. So, mental health for us is something that has come up so frequently in our work in the last 2 years, maybe even the last 4 years. And incrementally, we've been having to think about how do we actually create space where, when we do direct a survivor to a shelter, that we also ensure that the shelter that we're directing the services to or the survivor to is aware of mental health, is trained and knows how to respond to it. Mental health is not the same as wellness, and I think people also cluster the two of them together. And oftentimes, and this again is about like kind of how people perceptions and how people are perceived. So if you are doing some form of exercise, if you are doing yoga, breath work, those kind of things, that there's an assumption that you also can't experience violence. The reality is that there may also be some of that experience. There may also be experience of the lifestyle that you live being linked to someone who is abusive, which is, you know, part of the question that you're asking. And so everyone at every level, there's a lot of consideration that you have to make. And so one of the things that Mosaic does when a survivor does disclose and they come into our services is that we try and understand a bit more about like what their circumstances are. We try and learn more about how we can like develop a bit of a contingency plan, which we call a safety plan. And it's really customized by the individual. We also develop with the social workers what they call an individual development plan. And part of that really is to be able to understand that what is it going to take for you to be able to break loose from a financially dependent situation or a situation where the abuse is linked or the abuser or the person who uses violence in the relationship is also the financial breadwinner. How are we able to kind of retract from that? And it's difficult. There is no quick answer to this. We have come up with what we thought would be a skills based opportunity. So we try to learn skills that it actually start in our shelter. So skills that individuals have, for example, said they'd really like to learn about this or that. And we find ways to be able to support those skills. And one of the skills based opportunities was really thinking through sewing because there's been like a big kind of interest around it. And being in the Western Cape and, for example, with the history of factory workers, it felt like a very good fit. But I will say that now, we're now living on the other side of that being like such a success that it's now kind of turned into an incubator, but it's still not serving enough if you're thinking about the number of individuals that's unemployed. But again, it feels like we are trying to put a plaster on a bigger issue. Like I mentioned before, the issues around gender based violence is not just like centered around the violence. It's the violence is the event, it's the thing that everyone gets to see. But what is kind of like lurking under the surface is the high levels of unemployment. Exactly. It's thinking about like the experience of violence. It's thinking about like the accessibility of alcohol and drugs. It's thinking about kind of organized crime and how people get like pulled into that as an alternative. We recognize the fact that there's a lot of trafficking that happens. We recognize the fact that there are a lot of migration conversations that's happening that also has an impact on the violence that is happening within the homes. You know, what if my passport or my being here is tied to a South African partner who is abusing that and therefore abusing me? And that's also my financial tie. It's so complex. You know, my answer to you cannot be like a once off answer or one that kind of really fully addresses, but it's maybe to say that there is a lot of awareness about the impact of kind of mental health, and not just on the survivors. I have to mention this, that it's also on those who are extending the services, so who are at the front line, those who are working within the sector. It's also thinking about how do we ensure wellness for them and for their mental health, because the reality is that one of our court support workers actually sees about 25 survivors coming for protection orders, and what that translates to is really 25 traumas in one day. That's minus the things that she's coming with in her personal home, you know, and she's still living in the same communities that she is serving, so she has to use the same public transport like that everyone else is using. She has to wake up early, ensure that there's childcare. And so, you know, we're really living in the complexities of not just the survivor, which of course is the center of our work, but also thinking about those that are extending the quality services and those who are working within the sector itself. And I think that, again, you know, we try as far as we can as an organization to ensure the wellness of our colleagues. We have a wellness manifesto. We really invest in gathering to just have fun, aside from how heavy the work is that we have to deal with every day. And we try and also create and ensure that staff members do take leave and that they take the time to be and build with their families, because the reality is that if we don't take care and if we don't absorb some of the care, it does mean that the survivors will not be getting the quality services because they will be met with people who are traumatized themselves. And so I do think that, like, you know, the question around mental health is a big one, and one that we are still trying to like figure out as organizations, but one that we're very much invested in and training a lot of our colleagues on, and trying to also be aware that like it needs to be at every level of the service.
Absolutely. And also, like you said, there's obviously a focus on the survivor and the people, the children and the women and whoever the survivor is. But there also needs to be, a focus more on the rehabilitation of these individuals causing this violence and sort of interventions that are breaking these cycles, because
Mm.
that person will just go out and partner up with someone else and perpetuate this constant, it's just terrible. There's so many holes that need plugging, really. It's not just a one.
Yeah.
Okay, I wanted to ask you, women are carrying so much today. Can you give us 5 takeouts or behaviors or tools that can help them manage their load on a daily basis? Things
Yeah.
that can just
This is
make it a bit.
usually this is what I wish you could tell me. But what we often do is, I guess one of the important things is, someone said something so interesting, is like kind of paying attention to your breath, because it really
Yes.
does do something for the nervous system. And so I don't want to be airy flary, but it's about being able to like have a moment where you're just able to have that. And I know that it's a privilege. And I know that all of us have access to that. And so it's also just having mindfulness about how that can happen. But what we also tried doing at the office is like to schedule some time on your phone to say, for the next 5 minutes, that's all I'm going to do. Live in gratitude and being mindful of, like, you know, like my breath and my presence. I think it's also about being able to, you know, yourself, like understanding what it is that you'd need to be able to get through your next step. I think it's very important also, as individuals who live in a country where there is so much violence, is to know what are our human rights and how those human rights are being impacted through gender-based violence, and where you can go to activate the rights. But also, where can you go if the rights, or if the policy is not being extended in the manner that it must be, or that it was envisioned at. And so I think educating ourselves is also an important part of being present in this world. And so I think I'm counting 3. And the fourth one is also just thinking about like how do we build community. Also, I guess one of the ways that we have been trying to do that is really extend opportunities. So we do have volunteer opportunities, and we talk about time, talent, and treasure. It's not just about your money. That could also help, and that would be a great help. But it's also about the time. Do you have a skill that you'd like to extend? You know, we were talking about economic
Yeah.
abuse. And so it's being able to like extend a skill, and maybe it's also about just extending your time. So being able to say, one afternoon, I want to come in and I want to pack K packs. You know, it's in the simple that we are all able to kind of chisel away and lift where we are. And I think that's kind of like the mindfulness that I want to extend. I can't think of a fifth one, but I do think that there's something about like enjoying life, you know, and so I don't really know what the recipe is. I'm trying to find, I don't think I can find balance. I think I can find harmony. And that's really what I'm trying to reach for. And maybe that's something to also kind of relieve yourself from the pressure of like, you know, always finding balance, being able to exercise, being able to eat well, being able to like be present and like fill in your journal, but also being able to have grace for some days are really tough and we just need to rest. Other days are great and let's socialize and let's find ways to impact the world, especially the world that we are living in.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, I wanted to ask if there are any upcoming events, workshops, or collabs that you can let us know about, and then the contact details.
Mm, no, absolutely. It's very difficult to call people into like our kind of workshops because the workshops are quite sensitive. They're in communities. But we'd like to encourage individuals who may be listening to this. If you have an HR department and you're trying to think about ways to inform everyone in your community, and I'm talking about work community or even community as in like the living environment, please do call on us. You know, it's as easy as handing out pamphlets, creating awareness, being there to answer questions that people may have, building confidence to know what the next steps are when someone is disclosing to you. So I really want to encourage that as an alternative to coming to what our sessions will look like. We are able to do norms training, gender norms training. We are able to do first responder training. You know, the opportunities are all there. And so I'd really like to encourage people to do that. I think the most important place to go to is our website. So it's www.mosaic.org.za. And it really will connect you with all of the social media platforms. We're on Instagram, we're on Facebook, we're on LinkedIn. And we try and share as much information on all of those platforms, especially also thinking about who will be accessing those. And we want to make sure that even if there is someone who may not feel like they want to pick up the phone and talk to someone, but maybe they want to share a DM with us on either of those platforms, feel free. Someone is waiting on the other side to help you, and you're not alone. And so that's my encouragement.
Amazing. Thank you so
Yeah,
much for all of this information. I think it's so important to spread the word and let women know that they're not alone in these situations and there is help out there. Thank you so much,
absolutely.
Ronel.
Thank you. I really appreciate you making the space, especially on this channel. It means a lot to us.